The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of others at the JFK Library Foundation or the JFK Library, including staff, board, or donors. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational information purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
And then he goes on to say, we set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and so forth. So he's using, whether he sees it that way or he's just using it as a convenient metaphor, space is this new ocean before us that needs to be explored.
President John F. Kennedy's connection to the sea ran throughout his life, from sailing the waters off the Massachusetts coast as a boy, to serving as a naval officer in the Pacific during World War II, to leading the nation with a deep commitment to protecting America's oceans and coastlines.
This week, JFK Presidential Library Director Alan Price joins us to explore how the ocean shaped President Kennedy's life and leadership, and why our seas have also played such an important role in America's 250-year story. That conversation is next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. Welcome to our special America 250 season of JFK 35. As the United States marks its 250th anniversary, we'll explore the ideas, values, and debates that have shaped our nation from its founding to the present day. This week, Boston is welcoming the return of the tall ships as part of the America 250 celebration. More than 60 historic vessels have sailed into the city's harbor, creating Boston's largest gathering of tall ships in more than 25 years.
In that seafaring spirit, we're taking a closer look at how the sea and sailing shaped the life and legacy of our 35th president. Joining us today is JFK Presidential Library Director Alan Price. We're speaking from the library's 7th floor overlooking the waters of Columbia Point, where ships have sailed for centuries, long before America even became a nation. Alan, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Great topic. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the conversation with you too.
We're going to start this conversation today about President Kennedy and the sea. It's a topic we thought would be important for this special summer series on America 250 because the sea has played such an important role over the years for the country, but especially for the nation's 35th president, President Kennedy. We're going to start just by hearing from the president himself talk about the sea. This is remarks from a dinner for the America's Cup cruise in Newport, Rhode Island, that was hosted by the Australian ambassador in September 1962.
I really don't know why it is that all of us are so committed to the sea, except I think it's because, in addition to the fact that the sea changes, and the light changes, and ships change, it's because we all came from the sea. And it is an interesting biological fact that all of us have in our veins the exact same percentage of salt in our blood that exists in the ocean. And therefore, we have salt in our blood, in our sweat, in our tears. We are tied to the ocean. And when we go back to the sea, whether it is to sail or to watch it, we are going back from whence we came.
So, Alan, as we hear from the president, we can clearly see the sea has always had a strong influence with him. What were some of those influences first as he grew up?
Well, we see President Kennedy refer to the sea, and by the way, I like that he says the sea rather than the ocean or some other reference. It just seems more poetic to say the sea. He refers to it throughout his political career, but yes, he grew up in and around beaches and the ocean, and as many folks know, he receives a sailboat for his 15th birthday, the Victoria, which he sails throughout his life. You know, he had sailing trophies from his boyhood. And while people certainly know that he served in the Navy during World War II, I think it was a real personal thing for him to be out on the water. It was a place where he could relax. He wanted to teach his wife, Jackie, how to sail. And they spent many hours out on the sailboat, as he also taught other family members.
And you mentioned John F. Kennedy being in part of World War II, which he initially was not seemed healthy enough to serve, but was able to use family influence to join the war effort. He joined the Navy and ultimately commanded a small ship, the patrol torpedo boat called PT-109. And it would be an experience that would change him forever. If you could tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yes, well, patrol and torpedo boats meant to disrupt the supply chain of the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. They are run over, T-boned, if you will, by the Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, late at night. PT boats are incredibly loud. They wouldn't have heard the Amagiri closing in on them. And 2 crew are lost in that collision, 1 badly burned, and President Kennedy swims the injured crewmen, and others follow to the nearest island, where they live off of coconuts for 6 days and try to avoid detection. And they're discovered by a couple of Solomon Islanders who are working as scouts for the Australian Navy, and they, well, I'm sure through some charades, an indication that you could carve a message into a coconut husk. And so he carves essentially 11 alive, Noro Island, native nose position, need a small boat, Kennedy, and that is canoed out to the Australian Navy. I'm told that's a 42-mile canoe trip to deliver that message, and that the Australians relay that message to the U.S. Navy, and that's how they're found and rescued. And it's an extraordinary tale of heroism, courage under fire. But when asked later about being a hero, he just said, well, they sank my boat.
Very classic Kennedy. I don't think I realized the length of that canoe trip of being 42 miles. I know Kennedy himself swam a lot, kind of a harrowing experience, but that he learned a lot of lessons from. What do you think some of those lessons are that he'd learn at this time period and then stick with for the rest of his life?
Well, I think one of the constant messages of the sea and sailing is that of self-reliance. And I think his ability to rely on himself in difficult situations served him well throughout his career. I also think that his ability to build strong bonds with his crew continued throughout his political career, as many people felt very personally connected to him and loyal to him because he was an inspiration.
You know, President Kennedy clearly felt a strong connection to the ocean as a New Englander, as a Navyman. He used a lot of seafaring language in his speeches and his communication. How did those influences guide his public life?
One of my favorite stories about Kennedy and the sea is that he gives an account that when he visited the USS Constitution in Charlestown as a boy, he said that the sight of that historic frigate with its tall spars and black guns stirred my imagination and made American history come alive for me. So I think there's even in that boyhood reference, but throughout his life, he collects scrimshaw from the 18th and 19th century. He collects models of tall ships. And then there's countless numbers of doodlings and drawings of sailboats from his time in the Oval Office and during meetings during his time in the White House.
There seems to be also something about the sea that draws people who will push boundaries or explore the unknown. So where do you think JFK fit into that tradition of sea lovers, and how do you think it influenced his leadership as president?
I think this notion of exploration, of new horizons, of adventure were very much a part of his psyche. Sometimes it creeps into his political speech in small ways, sometimes in big ways. In small ways, like in the inaugural address, there's a reference to a beachhead of cooperation. In the Rice University speech, there's a reference early on about those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the industrial revolutions, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space, right? And this is all wave sort of references. I love it. And then he goes on to say, we set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and so forth. So he's using, whether he sees it that way or he's just using it as a convenient metaphor, space is this new ocean before us that needs to be explored.
Yeah, you mentioned all these things that are happening at the time, space exploration, sort of new areas of exploration, even though that the world had been thoroughly explored maybe, but there were new things happening, right? People pushing for new rights and new horizons. What do you think it meant to have someone who was so romantic about these ideas of exploration, of risk-taking, to have someone who had, those strong beliefs as president at the time of the 1960s?
I love the term romantic. I think his romanticism, though grounded in the practical awareness of a naval veteran, helps us get through difficult times. The Cold War is going on, and he's giving the nation hope, rallying us as a nation to compete, essentially. Sometimes he does make Army references about claiming the high ground, but mostly these are naval references, and I think they're very relatable. And I think they are used to help build American support to marshal as many forces as we can towards that race and ultimately win it.
And kind of zooming out a bit from Kennedy and looking at kind of more nationally and from the beginning of our country, the ocean's a part of the American story from the beginning and even kind of before America began. As we approach America 250, what stands out to you about the sea's influence on the country's history and identity?
So much of America is formed sort of through the ocean, arriving, for many Americans arriving by ocean on ships, whether that's voluntarily or involuntarily. There's the settling of America for so many people. It is along the coasts. Initially, large settlements tend to be around deepwater harbors along the coast, and much of the early economy is linked to, if not the sea directly, but trade using the sea. So much of America's identity is formed through the reality and the mythology of the sea.
And, we happen to be right now seated on the 7th floor of the library overlooking the historic Boston Harbor, where the tall ships will be visiting this year. But as you look out at Boston Harbor, this historic harbor from the JFK Library, it's really not hard not to think about all the history these waters have seen. What does it mean for you that President Kennedy's sort of living memorial is located right here along the ocean?
I think it's tremendous. I think it's absolutely linked to President Kennedy, one of his greatest joys, to be by the water, to have his memorial space be right next to the water. I think Mrs. Kennedy, in helping to select this spot, had the opinion that Jack would have liked this as a location for it. In many ways, it looks roughly in the direction of Ireland, from whence his ancestors arrived, Boston being a big part of his upbringing and home. And I think it's an inspirational space today for people who come and visit and learn about the history. I think in its own right, the building and the grounds are inspirational. Then you add the collections and the sense of history, and of course our wonderful staff who bring it to life.
And I wouldn't be remiss without closing out this interview with the fact that you yourself are a sailor, and know how to sail.
I've enjoyed sailing. I've owned several sailboats. Most of the time you do maintenance, but sometimes you get out on the water and it is gorgeous.
And so when you are out on the water and not doing maintenance on your sailboat, what is it like for you, especially being someone who has been steeped in sort of President Kennedy the last several years? What is it like when you're out on the water, imagining, being in the same situation that, the president really felt the most comfortable, which was sailing his own boat out on the waves?
For me, there's really nothing quite like it. There are many attempts, but nothing quite like the joy of catching the wind and moving forward at some velocity. And if you get a chance to do it and even sail far enough offshore that you can no longer see land, it is magical. It is also, at times, bad weather times in particular, incredibly stressful.
And how do you imagine President Kennedy, you never got to be on a boat with him, but how would you imagine he would have enjoyed being in that position, sailing away from land and into the open water?
I think it was even more a part of his DNA than it is of mine, and so I would be very happy to have him at the tiller. If I might add another thing.
Please.
Two things, actually. One is I was struck by some remarks that President Kennedy gave on the aircraft carrier, the USS Kitty Hawk. And he quoted Admiral Mann, who said more than 50 years ago at that time, these remarks are delivered in June of '63, that any country which wishes to protect its security and the security of those allied with it must maintain its position on the sea. And if there's any lesson of the 20th century, and especially of the past few years, it is that in spite of the advances in space and in the air, in strategic air, this country must still move easily and safely across the seas of the world. And I just love his succinct way of saying how important it is, in spite of all these other technologies in the race for space, the sea is central. The other thing I would point out, we so focus on President Kennedy's love of the sea. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the deep love of the sea of Mrs. Kennedy. And so for that, I would just reference a poem she wrote in 1939 at the age of 10, titled Sea Joy. When I go down to the sandy shore, I can think of nothing I want more than to live by the booming blue sea as the seagulls flutter round about me. I can run about when the tide is out, with the wind and the sand and the sea all about, and the seagulls are swirling and diving for fish. Oh, to live by the sea is my only wish. And I thought, he found a kindred spirit.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing those words from both President and Mrs. Kennedy. Thank you always for allowing us to have you on.
Always a joy to be with you.
Thanks for joining us again, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our latest podcast episode in our special America 250 Summer Series. If you're interested in learning more about some of the items we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. It includes links to all of the items we mentioned today.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tag us at jfklibraryfdn using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.